When Tyler Boone dragged rotted cottonwood trunks, empty whiskey barrels, and rusted chain down to the low ground beside the Red Fork River, the ranchers laughed so hard some of them nearly fell off the fence rail. Warren Pike called it a duck house. Dean Mercer bet the first hard rain would flip it over like a busted feed trough. But Tyler was not building a house meant to stand still on the earth. He was building something meant to survive when the earth disappeared beneath it. Old mud lines on the trunks of the trees had warned him long before anyone else in the valley thought to look, and he had spent enough of his life on moving water to know that a river never truly forgets a path it has once carried. And when the spring flood finally tore down through the valley, it was the richest houses that went first. If you think a floating cabin sounds like a joke, wait until you hear what happened when the river swallowed the whole valley, and what it finally cost the men who never believed water could humble them. The story begins in the Red Fork Valley, in Montana Territory, in the late 1880s, in a place that looked almost gentle in the summer months, with tall grass rolling out toward the hills, fat cattle grazing along the bottomland, and the Red Fork River curling through the middle of it, like a ribbon of hammered silver. The wealthiest ranchers in the valley prized the low ground closest to the water above anything else. Because the grass grew thickest there, the water was always near, and the cattle never had to walk far to drink after a long summer day on the range. Land near the river meant easy living, and easy living was the only kind of wisdom most of them ever bothered to respect, since none of them had lived through a season hard enough to teach them otherwise. Into that world walked a man nobody quite knew how to place. Tyler Boone was not a rancher, had no herd carrying his brand, and owned no wide house with a porch facing the hills the way the founding families did. He had spent years working ferries, lashing together log rafts, and hauling drowned ferry wreckage out of flooded water further south, and none of that experience meant a single thing to men who measured worth in acres and cattle and horseflesh rather than in scars earned on moving water. In Red Fork, a man was respected for what he owned on dry land, not for what he understood about the river that ran past it, and Tyler understood early on that no amount of explaining would change that. Tyler bought a cheap strip of ground on the outside curve of the river, a piece nobody else wanted because the soil there was soft, choked with reeds, and considered good for nothing but mosquitoes and misery. Warren Pike had once said, loud enough for half the saloon to hear, that only snakes, skeeters, and failures made their home on ground like that, and the room had laughed along with him without a second thought. But Tyler saw something the others refused to see. He saw mud lines baked hard and pale, far higher up the cottonwood trunks than any man in town would have guessed possible, lines that ran well above where any ordinary spring runoff should have reached. He saw driftwood and river trash caught in branches well above the height of a standing man, hanging there like some quiet warning nobody had bothered to read in years. He saw the north bank gouged out in long, raw scars, the unmistakable signature of water that had once come through with force, enough to twist the whole valley floor and reshape the very ground beneath it. He understood something the ranchers refused to believe, which was that the Red Fork River had once climbed higher than every house they had ever built beside it, and that a river which had done such a thing once could do it again without asking anyone's permission or waiting for a convenient season. Tyler spent long days walking the riverbank, not watching the water as it moved now, but reading the marks it had left behind, moving slow along the mud like a man reading a page written in a language only he understood. He studied bark stripped clean in long, ragged patches, stones shifted out of their natural resting order, fine silt dried onto branches that had no business holding silt at that height, and roots exposed where the bank had been eaten away, slow and steady, over years of quiet erosion. He found one old cottonwood with a dried mud line, almost level with a rooftop, and beneath the bark of that same tree, worn nearly smooth by weather and time, he found a carved date that most men would have walked past without a second glance, a rough inscription reading Spring Flood, 1867. Standing there with his hand pressed against the old scar in the wood, Tyler remembered something his father had told him. Back when they worked the ferry crossings together on a wider, meaner river far to the south. Water does not need to defeat a man through strength, his father had said, resting a hand on young Tyler's shoulder as the current slid past beneath their raft. It only needs to return to the path it once carried, patient and certain, waiting for the day the land forgets it was ever there. That single lesson would end up sitting at the very center of everything that followed in Red Fork. Tyler carried that truth into town and tried to hand it to men who did not want it. Standing in the middle of the saloon with mud still drying on his boots, while he explained what the coming spring might bring. He warned them that the season looked dangerous, that the mountains above the valley had carried an unusually heavy pack of snow all winter long, and that if a warm rain arrived early enough, the melt would not come gently, drop by drop, but all at once, crashing down through the valley like a herd, gone mad and blind with fear in the middle of the night. Warren Pike dismissed him outright, reminding anyone who would listen that his family had ranched Red Fork for 12 years, without the water ever climbing so much as a single step toward his porch, and he said it with the flat certainty of a man who had never once needed to doubt himself. Dean Mercer laughed along and asked whether Tyler now planned to teach a river how to run its own course, as if men who had raised cattle along that ground longer than Tyler had been breathing needed instruction from a total stranger who owned nothing but a patch of reeds. Cole Brantley put it more bluntly than either of them, saying that if a real flood ever did come, men with solid houses and strong horses would survive it just fine, while men sleeping down among the reeds would not live long enough to complain about being proven wrong. Only Naomi Hale stood quiet through all of it, listening in a way none of the others in that crowded room seemed to bother with. She remembered her own father, who had died trying to cross the river after a warm rain one long Argo march. His horse swept out from under him before anyone could reach the bank in time, and though she was not ready to defend a stranger out loud in front of the whole town, something in her had already started paying closer attention to the color and the sound of the water outside. Tyler did not have the money to buy good lumber and raise a proper cabin up on the high ground the way any sensible man in his position would have done. He went to Cole Brantley's store, hoping to buy chain, long nails, tar, and a few boards of dry lumber on credit, only to be turned away flat, since spring supplies were already climbing in price, and Cole was not inclined to extend credit to a man with no cattle to put up as security against the debt. Tyler left the store with almost nothing worth boasting about. Some old hemp rope coiled and fraying at the ends, a handful of bent nails salvaged from a torn-down fence, a barrel of tar with a cracked and leaking lid, and a few empty whiskey barrels discarded behind the saloon that nobody else had thought worth hauling away. He supplemented that meager haul by scavenging dead cottonwood trunks from along the bank, planking pulled from a wrecked ferry further downriver, rusted chain from an abandoned landing site, and iron hooks bent nearly useless by years of rust and neglect. Rather than raising a house on a fixed foundation the way every other man in the valley had done, without a second thought, Tyler built a great floating platform, using the cottonwood trunks as his main buoyancy, lashing them together crosswise with heavy timbers salvaged from the old ferry, packing the sealed and tar-coated barrels in underneath for extra lift, and anchoring the whole structure to 2 deep posts driven into the bank with chain run tight between them. The cabin that finally rose out of that strange labor was nothing to look at. Low and wide with a heavy floor and a light roof, a stone hearth set in the middle on a raised platform fitted with a latch to keep it from sliding when the floor tilted beneath a man's feet, and a single door facing the slow current instead of the dangerous eddies that churned further downstream. Dean Mercer rode out one afternoon to see the finished structure and could not stop laughing at what he found, calling it a duck house loud enough for half the valley to hear him from clear across the water. Warren Pike arrived not long after, sitting tall on his horse in front of a growing crowd of curious onlookers, and announced that only a man denied decent land would ever build a home that looked like it was waiting patiently to be carried off by the current the moment it rose an inch. Tyler never argued with either of them, never once raised his voice or defended the strange shape of what he had built with his own 2 hands. He simply kept working the tar into the seams of his floor, one board at a time, as though the mockery hitting his back carried no more weight than the ordinary spring wind blowing down off the mountains. This part of the story deserves a closer look because the cabin's design was never as foolish as it appeared from the safety of the riverbank. Tyler was not building a boat, and he was never trying to build something that would drift freely down the river the way a raft might wander with the current. He was building a cabin capable of lifting itself away from the ground the moment the water rose, while still being held firmly in place by a careful and deliberate system of anchors he had worked out over many long nights. Under ordinary conditions, the cabin simply rested on the low ground, propped on wooden blocks the way any structure might sit through a dry summer, but the cottonwood hulls and sealed barrels beneath the floor were built specifically to lift the whole platform. The instant floodwater reached beneath it and pressed upward against the hull, Tyler relied on 3 separate anchors working together in careful sequence. The first anchor was a pair of thick wooden posts driven deep into the earth, spaced wide enough apart that the cabin could not spin sideways and twist itself loose in a hard current. The second was a length of chain running to a heavy stone buried deep in the bank, a technique rivermen called a dead man anchor, strong enough to hold firm long after weaker fastenings had already torn free and washed away downstream. The third was a secondary release line, a careful safeguard meant to let the cabin drift toward the reed banks, rather than be dragged and shattered against a rocky shoreline if the current ever grew too violent for the main anchors to hold against. He also cut an escape hatch into the roof with his own hands, and when Dean Mercer saw it, he laughed and joked that Tyler had built a door for birds to fly out of, never once imagining that if the water rose too fast, or if driftwood ever jammed the main door shut from the outside, that same roof hatch might be the only thing standing between a person and drowning inside their own home. The floor itself had 2 levels built one above the other, with the lower deck forming the floating base and a raised upper shelf where food, blankets, lanterns, and dry firewood could stay safe even if a little water crept in along the edges during a storm. He hung food from iron hooks well above the floor, kept his lanterns sealed inside battered tin boxes, and hid a long coil of rope beneath the bed frame where it would always sit within easy reach in the dark. The windows were small and set high in the walls, the roof pitched just enough that floating branches would glance off harmlessly, rather than strike it head-on and tear the shingles loose. And at the front of the cabin, Tyler built 2 wooden prow guards shaped like a rough letter, crude icebreakers, meant to shove debris off to either side before it could ever slam into the hull and do real damage. He tested the door latch a dozen times over, swinging it wide and shutting it again until the hinges moved without a single catch, since a door that jammed even once in the middle of rising water could cost a life he had no intention of losing. He packed the gaps around the window frames with tallow and cloth, checked every chain link by hand for rust weak enough to crumble under pressure, and walked the full length of the hull on his knees more than once, pressing his palm flat against every seam to feel for the faintest hint of give beneath the boards. Naomi Hale came by one quiet afternoon with a little bread wrapped in cloth for him, and asked, plainly enough, whether he truly believed the flood would rise high enough to need a floating cabin at all, standing awkwardly by the door as she waited for his answer. Tyler only pointed toward the old cottonwood, with its high, dried mud line, and told her that he did not put his trust in the river itself, only in the marks it had chosen to leave behind for anyone patient enough to read them. An early season rain sent the river up just enough for a real test, and Tyler waited until morning before cutting a shallow channel to let water pool around the base of the cabin and see how the whole structure behaved under real pressure. At first, everything worked exactly as he had planned it in his head through all those long winter nights, with the whole structure shifting gently the moment the water reached beneath it and lifted the hull free of the mud. Within a few minutes, though, one side of the floor tilted hard and sudden because 2 of the barrels underneath had let their tar seals fail without any warning at all. Water crept in fast through the widening seams, warping a few boards upward with a low groan of protesting wood, and one of the anchor hooks snapped loose entirely under the strain, forcing Tyler to wade knee-deep into the cold spring mud and lash the whole cabin back down with rope tied hastily around the nearest tree trunk. Dean Mercer and a handful of ranchers happened to be watching from the bank that morning, and they roared with laughter at the sight of Tyler soaked to the waist and struggling in the mud, with Dean telling anyone who would listen around town for days afterward that Tyler's duck house could not even stay afloat in a shallow puddle, let alone a real flood coming down off the mountains. Warren Pike turned the whole embarrassing episode into a running joke at the saloon that same evening, wagering a horse in front of witnesses that when the real flood finally arrived, Tyler's cabin would tip over completely before the chicken coop even had the chance to. But the failure taught Tyler exactly what he needed to know about his own design, and he refused to let the laughter slow him down for even a single afternoon. He realized the barrels were never strong enough standing alone, so he wrapped them in extra bark for cushioning, applied 2 full coats of tar instead of 1 careless layer, and lashed them together in tight clusters rather than leaving them scattered as separate, weaker units along the hull. He also lowered the weight of the stone hearth to bring the whole cabin's balance down closer to the waterline, added a pair of sturdy crossbeams for extra rigidity through the frame, replaced the hemp rope at every load-bearing point with rusted but far stronger chain salvaged from the old landing, and cut a wooden sliding channel into the ground beneath the hull, so the cabin would not catch or stick in the mud once the real water finally came rushing through the valley. March arrived carrying a strange and uneasy quiet over the valley, with days that warmed too quickly under a pale sun and nights that stayed bitterly cold, no matter how bright the afternoon had been only hours earlier. Snow in the mountains began melting steadily, but never evenly, pooling instead behind natural ice dams that had quietly formed upstream over the long winter months, without anyone in town paying much attention. Tyler watched the color of the river change day by day from where he stood on his narrow porch, shifting from its usual gray-blue toward a thick, churning brown that reminded him uncomfortably of rivers he had known further south, while fresh green branches began appearing in the current, a clear sign the water had already started tearing into higher ground somewhere upstream of the valley. At night he could hear the ice cracking in the far distance, a low and heavy sound rolling down through the hills that reminded him of far-off cannon fire from a war he had never fought in. He rode into town to warn Sheriff Travis Warren directly, sitting across the desk from him and explaining that the true danger was not simply rising water, but something rivermen further south called an ice jam, a build-up of ice and timber trapped upstream that could release all at once without warning, and that if such a release ever coincided with a heavy, warm rain, the entire valley would receive its flood, not gradually, but as a single wall of water arriving with almost no notice at all. The sheriff listened carefully, turning his hat over in his hands, but hesitated to act, knowing that ordering ranchers to move their cattle and belongings ahead of a flood that might never actually come would only bring their fury down on him for weeks afterward. Warren Pike made his position clear immediately when he heard about the warning, accusing Tyler of spreading fear simply to make his strange floating cabin look wise in hindsight and drum up some future business for himself. Naomi Hale quietly began moving sacks of flour, oil lamps, and blankets up to the higher floor of the saloon without telling anyone exactly why she was doing it. Working alone in the evenings after the last customers had gone home for the night. She also began advising the younger hands who slept in the lower rooms near the riverbank to move their bedrolls upstairs for the time being, phrasing it as simple caution rather than fear. Dean Mercer kept mocking the whole affair anyway, going so far as to nail a small hand-painted sign near the landing that read Boone's ferry house, rides available when hell floods, and the whole town laughed at it for a solid week. When Tyler finally saw the sign for himself, standing alone at the landing in the gray afternoon light, he simply took it down without a single word of protest, carrying it back to his cabin, and later using that very same board to reinforce the escape hatch cut into his roof. Rain came warm and heavy in the first days of April, and it fell in a way that felt wrong from the very start, thick and relentless, melting the mountain snowpack far faster than the ground below could ever hope to absorb it in a single night. A strange, damp wind moved through the valley all through the evening, carrying with it a smell of wet stone and turned earth, and hour by hour the river swelled visibly along its banks under the steady downpour. Tyler did not sleep at all that night, moving instead from anchor to anchor with a lantern in hand, checking each floating barrel, testing the roof hatch, securing the hearth, and hauling every last piece of food and equipment up onto the higher shelf inside the cabin before the water could reach it. He tied his old horse to a rise of high ground behind the property, speaking low and steady to calm the animal, then carried the last of his most valuable belongings up into the cabin himself, working with the quiet, deliberate calm of a man who had been waiting for this single night for longer than anyone in town realized. Just before midnight, the sound of the river changed entirely, no longer a simple rush of moving water, but something closer to a deep, rolling roar, as though 100 wooden wagon wheels were grinding their way down through the valley all at once in the darkness. Upstream, out of sight in the Black Hills, the great ice dam finally gave way beneath the pressure that had been building against it for weeks. The first surge of water came crashing down, carrying broken ice, uprooted trees, shattered fence rails, and the splintered remains of small outbuildings striking the riverbank hard, spilling across the low pastures and swallowing the river road whole before most families in the valley had even realized what was happening around their own homes in the dark. At Warren Pike's ranch, a hired hand fought desperately to open the livestock pen as the water climbed past his knees in the freezing dark, while the storage shed door jammed shut under a growing mass of floating debris pressed against it from outside. Dean Mercer ran out barefoot to save his horse, but was knocked flat by the churning mud before he could reach the fence, and Cole Brantley struggled to protect the goods inside his own store, even as crates began lifting off the floor around him and slamming into the walls with every fresh surge of water. Tyler's cabin shuddered the instant the rising water reached beneath its hull, a deep groan running through every timber at once, and within a single minute it lifted clean off the mud beneath it for the first time under real and terrible pressure. It did not tip, it did not break apart. It did not drift away uncontrolled into the churning dark. It simply floated, exactly as he had built it to do through all those long weeks of mockery and doubt. The flood kept rising through the night, and Tyler's cabin was no longer any kind of joke to anyone who happened to see it now from the drowning banks. It floated steadily in the middle of the brown, churning water, held fast by its chains and anchor posts against a current strong enough to uproot full-grown trees. Every time a large tree trunk came barreling downstream out of the darkness, the wooden prow guards at the front deflected it cleanly off to one side with a heavy shudder that rattled through the whole frame. The low roof let wind and rain slide past without catching, and though the floor shuddered violently with every impact, the raised upper shelf inside stayed dry and steady through all of it. Tyler looked out through one of his high windows and watched the entire valley transform into a wide, violent river in front of his own eyes, a sight he would never fully describe to anyone afterward. Fence lines had vanished entirely beneath the surface. Warren Pike's cattle pens had been torn clean away from their foundations and scattered downstream in pieces. Part of Dean Mercer's house had spun sideways before finally being swept into a stand of cottonwood trees near the bend, and the largest, proudest house in Red Fork, the one everyone had once called the sturdiest building in the whole valley, was being torn apart plank by plank as the current slammed relentlessly into its porch. Sheriff Travis Warren tried desperately to lead a few families toward the high ground on foot, but the rising water had already cut off the road behind them before they made it halfway. Naomi Hale and several others were trapped upstairs at the saloon, listening to the water climb the staircase step by step below them in the dark. The door downstairs was blocked by a growing tangle of river debris pressed hard against it from outside, and there was no way out through the front of the building at all. Tyler understood in that moment that his cabin was never meant to save only himself from the flood, and that if he handled the anchor lines carefully enough, it could become something closer to a lifeline for the whole stranded valley behind him. He released the secondary line and let the current carry the cabin along a shallow diagonal path rather than fighting the main flow head-on and risking the hull against the strongest part of the current. He guided the whole structure slowly from the reed banks toward the saloon, steering not like a man rowing a boat, but like a man letting the river do the heavy work while he simply adjusted the ropes to keep his course true through the dark. Naomi saw the cabin appear through the driving rain like a single warm light, drifting across a dark and drowning river, and for a moment she thought she might be imagining it out of pure desperation. Tyler threw open his roof hatch and cast a line up toward her window, calling out over the roar of the water for her to grab hold and not let go for anything. One by one, the frightened adults trapped inside the saloon gripped that rope and crossed over into the floating cabin through the driving rain, boots slipping on the wet rope line with every step. There was nothing overly dramatic or impossibly heroic about any of it, since every single rescue that night was difficult and dangerous in its own quiet way, with ropes slipping loose, hands torn raw against the wet fiber, and the lantern flame nearly snuffed out more than once in the wind before Tyler managed to shield it with his own body. but the cabin held firm through every single attempt, never once tilting further than it had been built to allow. Afterward, once the last of the saloon's people were safely aboard, Sheriff Travis Warren pointed through the driving rain toward what remained of Warren Pike's house, where Warren and Dean Mercer were stranded together on a broken section of roof with floodwater spinning violently all around them in the dark. Two men who had once laughed loudest at Tyler's strange little cabin now stood soaked and shaking in the storm, staring across the water at the very thing they had once dismissed as nothing more than a duck house, seeing in it now their only remaining chance to survive the night. Tyler knew immediately that reaching Warren and Dean would be far more dangerous than anything he had attempted so far that terrible night. The current near the Pike property ran faster and angrier than anywhere else in the valley, thick with broken branches and shattered pieces of collapsed barn structure spinning through the dark water in every direction. If the main anchor chain ever gave way completely under that kind of pressure, the cabin could easily be swept into a narrow, rock-choked bend of the river with little hope of recovery for anyone aboard. Sheriff Travis Warren wanted to wait until daylight to attempt any further rescue, arguing that the risk was simply too great in the darkness. But Tyler looked up at the driving rain and understood plainly that daylight would arrive far too late for the two men trapped ahead of them on that crumbling roof. He cut loose part of the secondary line to let the cabin drift further out into the stronger current, using the main anchor chain as his final limit against being swept away entirely. And the whole structure lurched forward through the churning water, clipping a broken fence line hard enough to make the timbers groan and tilting sharply enough to make everyone inside hold their breath at once. Tyler stayed perfectly calm through it, shifting weight to one side of the floor, lowering the cabin's center of balance with practiced hands, and steadying the whole platform through sheer patient effort until it leveled out again beneath them. As the cabin closed the final distance to what remained of the Pike roofline, Dean Mercer was the first to catch sight of Tyler through the rain, his face drained completely white in the lantern light, every trace of his old arrogance gone in an instant. The very man who had once mocked the duck house in front of half the valley now had to crawl across a soaked, splintering plank simply to climb aboard it and save his own life. Tyler threw the rescue line without a moment's hesitation. Dean nearly lost his footing on the way across, boots slipping against the wet wood, but Tyler hauled him in safely with one steady pull. Warren Pike, injured in the shoulder and shaking badly from the cold and the shock of it all, stared at Tyler for a long moment through the driving rain before finally reaching out and taking hold of the rope himself. There were no grand apologies exchanged over the sound of the storm that night, no dramatic speeches shouted across the water. There was only the plain and undeniable truth settling over both men at once, since Warren's own house was being torn apart, piece by piece behind him, while the floating cabin he had mocked for weeks was the very thing now keeping every one of them alive in the dark. As Warren climbed inside, his eyes landed on the old weathered sign Dean had once nailed up as a joke, the one reading Boone's ferry house, and he saw that Tyler had mounted it inside the cabin wall as a simple reinforcing board, as though the old mockery itself had quietly become part of the structure holding them all up through the night. Warren said quietly, almost to himself, that he had expected the whole thing to sink from the very beginning. Tyler answered simply that he had built it because he understood that the highest ground in a valley is not always the safest place to stand when the water finally decides to come home. That single exchange, spoken low and plain against the sound of the storm, carried more weight than anything either man could have said with a raised voice in the daylight. Morning arrived, and the rain finally stopped, though the water still ran fast and hard, even as it slowly began to drop back toward its banks throughout the long day. The Red Fork Valley no longer looked anything like the peaceful place it had been only a day earlier, its fences gone entirely, its barns shattered into scattered timber, several houses torn completely from their foundations and carried off downstream, and thick brown mud coating what had once been bright green pasture as far as anyone could see. Tyler's cabin had drifted into a shallow bed of reeds and lodged there gently as the water receded, still tethered to its main anchor post, scratched along one side and missing several patches of roofing, yet still floating, and more importantly, every single person who had sheltered inside it through the long night was still alive to see the sun rise over the ruined valley. Sheriff Travis Warren later wrote in his official report that if not for Tyler Boone's floating cabin, the death toll across the valley would almost certainly have been far higher than it turned out to be that spring. Naomi Hale was the first person in Red Fork who stopped calling it the Duck House entirely, choosing instead to call it the Red Fork Ark, the vessel that had carried the valley's survivors safely through its very worst night. Warren Pike lost a great deal of what he owned in the flood, his cattle scattered and his house half destroyed, but he lived to see the following summer, and weeks later, once the valley had begun the long, slow work of rebuilding, he went to find Tyler in person at the little cabin, still resting in its bed of reeds. He did not ask to buy the secret of the design, nor did he ask for any kind of favor owed between men. He simply asked Tyler, standing there with his hat in his hands, to teach the valley how to build houses set higher off the ground, how to anchor storage buildings more securely, and how to read the old flood marks left behind on the trees the way Tyler had learned to read them himself over years of quiet observation. Tyler agreed to help without hesitation, but only under one condition that he stated plainly and would not bend on, insisting that the poorer families living closest to the river be helped first, and that no one in the valley should ever again be allowed to sell flood-prone land to a desperate buyer only to laugh at him later when the water finally came for what was his. By the following summer, many of the new homes built across Red Fork no longer sat close to the low ground near the river. Several storage buildings had been raised up on tall support posts driven deep into solid earth, and even Cole Brantley, who had once turned Tyler away without a second thought, kept a coil of good chain and a barrel of tar set aside every spring from then on, just in case the valley ever needed reminding again. Children who had been too young to remember the flood itself grew up hearing the story anyway, told and retold at supper tables and around fires until it hardened into something the whole valley simply understood to be true, that the water always kept its own accounting and eventually returned to collect what it was owed. And down near the old landing, the townspeople chose to keep the weathered wooden sign that had once been meant as a cruel joke, changing its words instead to read Boone's ferry house, the cabin that floated when the valley drowned. They had once laughed because Tyler built a house meant to float on water no one believed would ever rise that high. But when the river finally came and swept the solid ground out from beneath every other home in the valley, his was the only one that still remembered how to stay.